So, good afternoon. Here in the room and online, I'm sorry that we're running late, but it's a tough task to synchronize the on and offline events. So let me welcome you to this afternoon panel, Hidden Heritage in Endangered Archives, which will be chaired by Frank Mecklenburg, who will join us online. He is Director of Research and Chief Archivist at Leo Baeck Institute, and is also part of our cooperation partners here at this workshop. As a chief archivist, Dr. Mecklenburg is responsible for overseeing the acquisition of a new collection for the Institute's extensive archival holding. He works closely with community organizations to identify potential donors and liaises directly with donors and their families to arrange the gift of their personal papers and artifacts. So I think he's really a specialist for this conference here, and I'm happy to have you here, and now I'm giving the floor to Frank. Yeah, Frank.
Yeah, hi, thank you. So I'm speaking remote from New York, and I wish I could have been there, but a number of circumstances prevented me from coming to Vienna. And so without further ado, I want to introduce the panelists, and I will go actually with introductions as we coming to the next one. And we are starting with Julie Dawson, who is a doctoral candidate at University of Vienna and has degrees from Columbia University and Northwestern. And she has been working for the Leo Baeck Institute, with the Leo Baeck Institute since 2010. And she is been the director of the archival survey project of Transylvania and Bukovina, and which resulted in a website that is available at Leo Baeck Institute. And she was also the researcher in residence in Mediasch and for the EU Horizon project. And she will be talking about agency or atrocity. And this is about the demolition of rural Transylvanian synagogues in post-war Romania. Please, Julie.
Thank you very much, Frank. And it's lovely to see you, even though only virtually. Okay, good. So I'm timing. I'm going to try to stay on schedule. We'll see. The speakers on this panel, if I'm not mistaken, we are all archivists in some fashion, and we're all talking about or even reporting on surveys or similar projects that we've carried out in the past, I believe under the auspices of the Rothschild Foundation's Urusha project, and you can all correct me if I'm assuming too much, which was and is a project spearheaded by the Rothschild Foundation to survey hidden or unexplored Jewish archives or archival material related to Jewish history in Europe. Today, I'm going to give an overview of the survey that I led, which Frank just mentioned, which took place under the administration of the Leo Baeck Institute of New York, Berlin from 2013 to 2019. I'm going to touch on its geographic scope and sketch out some of the contents found. But then I want to hone in on two particular sister collections, and this is where my title comes from, that relate to the mass demolition of rural synagogues in the post-war period in northwest Romania. The material surveyed by the archival survey project was vast, and it could feed numerous long-term research projects. It ranges from the late 18th century to the post-war period and bridges many areas of focus. But with the presentation in more detail of just one collection, I hope to demonstrate the breadth of possibility in these collections and perhaps eventually spur others to pick up where we left off. One of the original aims for this conference when we began planning it several years ago was the dissemination of the results of this survey, and others like it, to a pool of researchers with the idea to stimulate interest in these recently uncovered precarious archives. The Leo Baeck survey initially began as a one-year project. I would say in hindsight, an exploratory or pilot project. It was focused on southern Bukovina and southern Transylvania, the two regions in today's Romania where Jewish communities were largely German-speaking. Obviously, they also spoke other languages. It was a very multi-ethnic, multilingual area. We're talking about the Habsburg Empire. The project began with a focus on the National Archive branches of each county, with a secondary focus being the contemporary Jewish communities. But because access to these communities was unpredictable, they did not initially form the central ambition of the project. So this is the website that came out of it. It wasn't created at the beginning. You can search you can search by repository, locality, you can search for keywords, and the map. You can also use the map to look around. So it only took a very short time in Suceava, this was back in 2013, Bukovina, to become aware of the magnitude of archival material available. The material in Suceava ranged from the expected, such as civil records. So this is the record of all the Jewish civil records in Suceava, and it doesn't fit on one screen. This was expected, but there were unanticipated rich discoveries, such as collections from the town hall of these small towns or police departments, which contain numerous folders of documents testifying to the busy activities of Jewish cultural organizations of the interwar period, to wartime anti-Semitic measures, deportations, and so forth. So, and a lot of this contents was in German, even though the inventories were in Romanian, which is one reason why it's particularly difficult for researchers to access, because you have to know Romanian, even if everything in the folders is German or Hungarian, in the case of Transylvania. So it became clear that the project should be extended in order to do justice to the wealth of information in the National Archives. A 3-year extension saw the geographic scope expanded to include central Transylvanian towns, as well as some of the central archival repositories in Bucharest. This longer time frame allowed for sustained interaction with the contemporary Jewish communities and took into account the possibility that the communities would have material, and indeed, they did. In Cluj, for example, we found quite a diverse and large amount of documents, but we also found sheet music, for example, from the Jewish orchestra that was created as a result of anti-Semitic measures during the war and pre-war time, and cantorial music, which is fascinating for scholars of cantorial music. There's also visual materials, such as a collection of photographs and artwork found in the synagogue attic, as well as a set of zincographs. A serendipitous collaboration with a Cluj artist allowed these zincographs to be printed. Zincographs, if I didn't know what they were, but they're metal images that are printed on metal. They were what newspapers used to make pictures, actually, historically, and then they would just be melted down and reused again. So these were just in a schrank, like a cabinet or a cupboard, and this artist had the means to print them again, so we left a set with the community, of course, as well as the blocks themselves. And I brought my set of prints, if anybody wants to look through them. Some are hanging on my wall, but some are here. In general, our project wasn't a digitization project, but in a few instances, such as these, we digitized the material that we found. So in the course of this period, it became clear that while the material held by the National Archives was important and complicated for researchers to access, the material potentially held by the extant Jewish communities was entirely unknown and possibly in physical danger. The project was extended for an additional 2 years. This time, the focus was put exclusively on surveying archival material held by the Jewish communities and placing this material in as secure storage conditions as possible, while leaving it in the possession of its home community. The aims were twofold: to understand what material was out there, as well as to empower the communities themselves with the means to care for this heritage. So these are the towns that today there are collections at these communities. In the course of the project, collections from Lugos, Arad, Satu Mare, Sighet, Dieves, Caransebeș were surveyed in process, and additional storage materials were delivered to Cluj, Târgu Mureș, Alba Iulia, where I had already been and already done an initial survey of their material. Finding aids were made for this material. This is what it looks like online. If you're interested in a particular community, you just you look in the repository of that community, and then the finding aid comes up. There's just essentially one, except for Cluj, there's only one finding aid per community. You can click on it, and you can download it as a PDF, or you can just read it there. And we translated everything into Romanian as well, and sent the hard copies to all the communities, with whom I want to say, for the most part, I had very positive relationships and who were very supportive of the project. So that is an overview. Am I doing? Okay, good. That's an overview of the project itself. You can imagine a lot happened. I'm just going to sort of go through a photo montage while I talk now. I could talk a lot about the work and the challenges and the material found. If anyone has specific questions about this part, serving aspect, I'm happy to take them afterwards or in a coffee break. What I want to do now is introduce a collection, or rather two sister collections, which I found particularly intriguing, shocking, and full of research potential when I encountered them back in the spring of 2019. So in April 2019, I traveled to Satu Mare to go through the community's material. And I'll just a short word about my process. I always did an initial scouting trip for 1 or 2 days to the site. I talked to the president. I tried to understand what material they had, make estimates of quantity and size, oversized material, registers, so I knew what to order. And I came back later together with an assistant, having sent the archival boxes and folders by post in advance, ideally, not always possible, as you saw me schlepping around on trains, archival boxes sometimes. Then together with my assistant, we would do what we jokingly called a blitz processing, putting the material into acid-free boxes, folders, recording details onto the contents so that we could create a finding aid later. The archivists amongst you may cringe at hearing about this. They were not ideal archiving circumstances, but it was the reality. And it was due both to the working conditions there, as well as my personal circumstances. I have young children in Vienna, and I couldn't be on the road for more than a week at a time. And I do want to say that this worked. This way of processing this information did work, largely because they had been pre-processed in some way like 60 to 70 years ago. So it wasn't a room full of loose documents. That did happen once in Mediaș, where there was a kind of a Genizot, like my colleagues are going to speak of, and that would, of course, have been impossible, and that material was processed in Mediaș through the means of a 2-year grant. So we're talking about completely different kinds of things. These materials, you can tell from the photos, were often already in some kind of folder, organized in some way with a date or something on it, which made it possible to go in and over 4 or 5 days' time put them into some kind of order. So in Satu Mare, we quickly found, this is the last picture from that part, that a significant portion of the documents had been created by an authority based in Oradea, not by the Satu Mare community at all. The contents of these folders, however, related to the administrative region around Satu Mare. This is presumably why the folders were at some point in time sent to that community. We don't know when they were sent there or by whom or why even. Well, we can imagine why. The same thing holds true for the sister collection in Sziget. The material was created by the same authority, a department of the Jewish Federation responsible for real estate and property. They were created for the most part by one person, Andrei Partos, more on him later, and deal exclusively with Jewish community property in the villages around Sziget or Satu Mare. The folders are organized by village name and frequently discuss cemetery uptake, but most often contain scores of documents related to the systematic demolition of synagogues and prayer houses in those villages in the 1950s and 1960s. In all instances, the demolition work was prompted and propelled forward by the Regional Department for Property of the Romanian Jewish Federation, and specifically the head of this office, Mr. Partos. So, these documents, in terms of their scope and quantity, represent an incredible source on manifold levels. Perhaps most obviously, on the spatial rung, the material is a testimony to the erstwhile ubiquity of Jews in rural space, once a definitive feature of the region and largely forgotten today. Simply mapping the sites, so all of these points are where there were synagogues that were torn down, that we have documentary evidence of in these collections. Satu Mare is the blue point, Sziget is the red, and the orange are the shuls that were by Sziget, and the purple by Satu. And here we go even, zooming in even closer, and these places, these are villages. You can see even at this level, the villages are so small that many of their names are not appearing on the map. Like, you have to zoom way, way, way in to even get to the name of the village today. Okay, these are villages often of a few thousand people or even less. At the time, definitely less. So simply mapping these sites reveals the extent of rural Jewish life pre-Shoah in the region. Also, on the physical level of analysis, many folders contain details regarding the buildings. Many of these villages had two shuls, an older one of wood and a newer one of stone. These details and others regarding the construction, such as the year it was built, the current condition at that time, the location within the village, the address, and so forth, are in many files. Some also have sketches, while others include actual photographs. It is likely that in no other repository can one find collected together such a quantity of details regarding the physical structures of this collection of synagogues. And now as I talk, I'm just going to scroll through some of the mostly the visual material. I will talk about this one. So this is a sketch of where the synagogue and the mikveh were located within the village. So they're on the main road, and the road next to the mikveh is called the bath lane or whatever. And then there's also sometimes sketches, very rudimentary. This one was by Bartosz, describing the condition, what the building was made of. But the file contents go far beyond providing merely a remarkable physical record, probably the final record prior to their destruction of these structures. Each folder contains copious correspondence regarding the targeted demolition. It was, namely, not a simple or straightforward undertaking, and there were multiple hurdles. But perhaps here I should back up and pose the question that arises, or at least what struck me when I first began reading these documents. Why? What was the impetus and the motive to dismantle these structures to, quote, remove all trace down to their foundations, end quote, as it is expressly worded in the contracts? And I want to insert here that I try very hard not to apply our contemporary sensibilities and context to this period. Of course, it is impossible not to imagine what it would have been like if some of these, even just a handful, had survived. It would have been like the highest density of shuls in Europe, I think, rural shuls in Europe. But I try not to think about like this, and also like, oh, but if they had kept it, it could be a cultural center. And this is obviously, there was a totally different time. Nevertheless, why? Like, why was he so intent on them being removed down to their foundations so that no trace was left, as it says in the contracts? So the first day I spent with the material, I felt physically ill by the end of the day, reading report after report by the central protagonist, Andrei Bartosz, regarding his ardent efforts to fundamentally erase these physical remnants of Jewish life. The euphemisms and circumlocutions he applied to describe the murder and resulting absence of the region's Jews were disturbing, and I could not understand what the point was. It seemed to have been financially motivated, and certainly this must have played a role. The building's materials were sold to an individual or the local council, who then demolished the building and used the materials for other purposes. The estimate of these materials influenced the purchase price. The land itself was sold separately or together with the building. The first night, I slept poorly, dreaming, literally I dreamt, of Bartosz riding on his motorcycle over hill and dell from village to village. He had a motorcycle, and he talks about it, evaluating buildings, signing contracts, pocketing the money, and watching with a smug expression in my dream as the buildings were torn down. But the next day, as I continued to wade through the documents, trying to find a compromise between the quick pace of processing required and my desire to understand and know more about this process, I began to see that the story was more complex, far more complex. Many documents revealed bitter feuds between Bartosz and local Romanian authorities, whom he accused of taking advantage of the Jewish community by stealing material prior to the conclusion of a contract or desecrating Jewish space. In several documents, this was in fact cited as the motive for the demolition of the buildings, to ensure that they would not be used for other purposes which could be offensive to Jewish belief. Suddenly, the fervor with which Bartosz seemed to be pursuing this undertaking acquired the sheen of agency. Was this, after all, a final and urgent effort to seize power over the fate of Jewish space, where no Jews were left to speak for themselves? A struggle to allow Jews to dictate what would happen to Jewish property and secure any profit arising therefrom for the Jewish community? To ensure that Jewish spaces and the memory of those who worshiped there could not become places of ridicule and contempt? What narratives were between the lines in Bartosz's bureaucratic reports of his site visits? As I skimmed page after page of material, this thought was also forced to yield to further caveats and complexities. The reality was that these were not yet spaces where no Jews were left to speak for themselves. On the contrary, Jews had returned, and this is an area where the communities were deported to Auschwitz in spring of 44. Not many, yet some, and their survivor responses to the efforts of this outside intervention, which seemed to be perceived as almost foreign and almost certainly hostile, to removing their shuls, is still another analytic lens through which myriad topics can be examined. The relationship between the city bureaucrat and country dweller, the assimilated and the religious, even the Auschwitz survivor and those Jews who were not deported. The survivors from these communities strove to bypass this regional Jewish office, and they sent their appeals directly to Bucharest, sometimes as individuals and sometimes as a community. This correspondence lays bare the fragile and fraught relationship between the capital, regional centers, and rural inhabitants. The appellants cited various grounds for the synagogues to remain. Some argued that they were still in use for religious or residential purposes. Whether a minyan existed or not seemed to mean nothing to them about that, by the way. One community explained that a building served intriguingly as the woman's house of prayer. Another wrote expressly that the shul had been built by their parents and they refused to see it demolished until they were gone from that place. Still another man, the only Jew left in the village, insisted that the space was holy and the shul must remain. Perhaps the most articulate and from today's perspective prescient reasoning came from a doctor who argued that, quote, the existence of the synagogue is necessary as a symbol of affirmation of Jewish presence, end quote. The bureaucrat reporting these words dismissed this argument as sentimental. The local Jews sometimes lost and sometimes won their cases. Answers from Bucharest often reveal the enormous cleft between Bucharest and Maramureș Jewish practice or Jewish identity. In the response to the man who insisted that the space was holy, Bucharest Jewish officials asked for whom and with whom did he hold religious services if he was the last Jew? A valid question from their religious administrative perspective, but entirely missing the point of the man's emotional relationship to the place. Thus, the correspondence testifies to the broad array of tensions and friction between local Jews, regional Jewish authorities, Bucharest Jewish authorities, Yiddish, Romanian, and Hungarian-speaking Jews, and, of course, the local non-Jews. Beyond the arguments and motivations for and against demolishing the buildings and the often extended process that was entailed, the folder shed light on further social aspects of post-war Jewish life in Romania, gravely underrepresented in scholarship today. Frequently included with the assessment of the synagogues or other communal buildings were reports on the resident Jews, as I mentioned a little bit just now, how they lived, the degree of religious observance, their education, poverty level, and even details as to their gardens are sometimes included. An analysis of these documents would offer an unusual and unique portrait of rural Jewish life in this region, which continued in the aftermath of the Shoah, at least at a diminished level, into the 1960s and even 1970s. The sources offer insight into questions of post-Holocaust Jewish identity and experience, memory and commemoration, and the relationship to space and home. One file includes a letter from a man begging to be allowed to die in his village and laid to rest with his ancestors. Another file contains a statement from a local villager, and I don't know whether he's Jewish or not, describing the synagogue as, quote, made of small stones and thus very old, end quote. And he goes on to say that the building bore the address number 1, signifying without a doubt that it was the first building ever to be constructed in this village. This is almost folkloric, right? So whether or not this is true, it offers great insight into the collective memory of the village at that time. In the 1970s, a man writes to request that the village mikveh be repaired for his 5 daughters. These and many other such instances challenge assumptions about religious Jewish life in the regions ravaged by the Holocaust in the decades after the war. Finally, I want to say just a few words on Andrei Patoš himself. Any elaborate study using these documents would require examining this man and his background. He single-handedly created a large part of the material, and his personality comes across at times fiery with righteous rage and other times cold and pragmatic. There are documents signed by him into the 1980s, meaning that he apparently worked in the capacity as director of this department for decades. Certainly, there are more files by and about him in repositories across Romania. So I'm going to stop there. I could go on for some time outlining potential narratives that could be unspooled through these documents. I didn't touch at all on perhaps the elephant in the room for some of you, the communist element. What role did ideology play here for the various parties involved? But these and more questions only serve to illustrate the sheer dimension of untapped research potential in Jewish community archives in Romania, and certainly not just there today. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your very taxing presentation. And but we, in terms of time economy, I want to go right ahead to the next speaker, who is Gábor Kádár, and he is the director of the Jerusha project. And that is the Digital Humanities Initiative by the Rothschild Foundation, the Hanadiv Europe project, a collaborator and supporter of this project that Julie was just talking about. Gábor has been involved in many projects, and I just want to mention a few that he was also involved in archival projects at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum and at Yad Vashem. And I want to give you the podium speaking about Endangered Jewish Community Archives Project. Thank you.
Frank, thank you very much. I would like to share my screen. One day in December 1896, Talmud scholar from Cambridge, Dr. Solomon Schechter, climbed a wobbly old ladder to peek into the attic of the Ben Ezra Synagogue in Futstat, Old Cairo. He was astounded to see piles and heaps of old books and documentary fragments in the attic. These are the words that he wrote about this experience. And this is Dr. Schechter in his Cambridge office trying to organize his findings. As you can see, all the fragments that he found, most of the fragments that he found are in these big crates, in these big boxes. That unique finding that later became known as the Cairo Genizot, it completely redefined Jewish studies, or at least it completely redefined what we know about medieval Jewry and in the Mediterranean. It held not only literary works, but also hundreds of thousands of pieces of archival materials that were created within a millennium. Private letters, court documents, texts and commercial records, community records, and other documentation. As I said, gave a very new understanding of how Jews lived in the Mediterranean within that time frame. And this image was taken somewhere in Europe. I'm not going to tell you exactly where, and in a minute I'll tell you why I don't tell you where the document was taken, where this image was taken. What you can see here is a synagogue. It's a stairway going up to the mezzanine of a synagogue, and within these boxes that are somewhat similar to Solomon Schechter's boxes and crates, you can also find fragments and documents that is recording a life and the operation of a Jewish community, in this case dating back to approximately 200 years. The community itself, the documents, what you can find in the boxes, they include organizational and financial records dating back to early 20th century, including list of community taxpayers, financial registry books, again, giving a detailed insight into the community's life over a century ago. I stop sharing now. So similarly to what authors Adina Hoffman and Peter called Cairo's sacred trash, you can find a lot of derelict Jewish community archives all across Europe, what you can similarly call, quote unquote, sacred trash. And while it would be unrealistic to expect that the exploration of these collections would redefine what we know about the life of the communities, just as the Fustat collection did, it is undoubted that endangered Jewish archival collections in Europe capture and record many aspects of community life, offering insight into centuries of Jewish presence in various European regions. And this information could be lost forever in the coming decades. So I would like to talk about a new project of the Rothschild Foundation Hanadiv Europe called the Endangered Jewish Community Archives. And the goal of this project is to make sure that this does not happen, so that information does not disappear. So let's define the scope of the project first. We are focusing on Jewish community archival materials that are not in the possession of professional heritage institutions. It's not in the on the possession of an actual archive, but it is held by Jewish communities. So what do we mean by community materials? As we know, typically community archives records created during the operation of a community include Pinkasim, recording the administrative functions of various bodies of the community, Hevra Kadisha books, vital registries, financial records, including tax registry sheets, and other documentation. Cemetery records also quite important. In general, administrative records created by various departments, organizations, and schools of the community. If you think about it, an operating Jewish community is a very prolific record creator. The Neo-Lopez Jewish community, which in 1944 had over 150,000 members and operated 7 schools, 40 associations, 88 foundations, and a network of hospitals, was actually one of the largest administrative bodies in the country. It was much larger than many towns and villages. But I will also not restrict the scope of the project only to these documents. Experience shows that when you look at a repository, especially if it's not an organized one, many other type of records, personal collections, press paper clippings, photo collections can be found mixed up with what you can call a core community material. And that could be of immense historical value. And speaking of the Cairo Genizot, I would not exclude Genizot at all from this research, even though it could be debated if they classify as archives, of course, but they hold records that are very informative about the history of the community. And I believe Andreas and Lenka, who know way more about Genizot than I ever will back me up on this. Just a few words about how the idea of the project was born. Many of you are familiar with the Foundation's Yerusha project, which Julia also mentioned, and Julia was also a very prolific contributor to the project. It's only a few months away from being launched. The basic idea of Yerusha is to create an online hub of information, kind of an online catalog of Jewish and Jewish-related documents. Creating the project, while we were creating the project, we have worked with institutions of the highest academic excellence, including the Leo Baeck Institute, and I hope this cooperation will go further in the near future. Now, while we were scoping Europe with the help of over 150 researchers in 28 countries, we have received a lot of information about derelict Jewish community archives. And I would like to refer to Julie's presentation again, because she was one of the main sources of that information. The foundation also supported quite a few of these community archives via its various programs, but no comprehensive efforts have been made until now to map those collections. I also have to add that we are familiar with the British Library's Endangered Archives programs. That is a large program of the British Library that aims at rescuing at-risk archival material all around the world. And I worked with the program 12 years ago. And obviously there are some methodological best practices that were created by the program that also helped us build the project. So once again, the core idea of the project that we are launching next year is to rescue this documentation from obscurity and oblivion. So how do we plan to do this? In short, we would like to support the communities to look after their material. The reason why I did not tell you where that image was taken was because we are not playing kind of a shame game. We are not pointing a finger at communities, but we'd like to help them. Drawing on the extensive network of the foundation with organizations, scholars, and communities, and also our drawing our own experiences, we have carried out an initial survey, and this is what we have found. We have identified close to 50 such repositories in 8 countries, but we have every reason to believe that there could be more. There are communities who are aware of the historical value of what they hold, and they have the means and they have the willingness also to take care of them. In this case, our job is to address the issues they define based on an already relatively favorable situation. Digitization, further storage space, and even a more granular cataloging process or conservation. This is, I would say, group number 1. Group number 2 are the documents that are held by communities who are aware of the value of their archives, but they don't really have the means to look after them. Here, we have to work with them to help them to identify the needs and support them in basic safeguarding steps, such as a survey, not necessarily a detailed cataloging, just to get a picture of what they have, ensuring the basic proper restoration condition, acid-free boxes, basic shelvings, and so on. And there are document holders who are not even necessarily aware of the heritage that they are safeguarding, or they are not willing to engage with the issue. In this case, the project's job is to start a conversation with the document holders about their materials and learn about the circumstances that created this situation in which important parts of archival heritage became endangered. And of course, there are community archives without a community. It's a rare case, but it happens. We are, case in point, Genizot, of course, but besides Genizot, bodies of community records could be found without a community every so often. Sometimes it happened that a community ceased to exist and its community records were given to another community, a larger community, or they were taken to professional archival institutions. But here in this case, I'm talking about specifically core archival documentation of the community that simply has no community to take care of it. One example, again from Hungary, there was a Jewish community that ceased to exist, and no one was left there except for an elderly gentleman with a key that opened a shed in the backyard. And in this shed, there were some core basic documents of that community, again dating back to the late 18th century, which is relatively old by Hungarian standards. The local Hebrew Kadisha was founded in 1795. And the gentleman was generous enough to engage with the Hungarian Jewish Museum and Archives, and eventually the documents were moved from this shed to the Hungarian Jewish Museum and Archives, where they are properly inventoried and looked after and taken care of. But this is relatively rare, as I said. In most cases, there's a community and there's an archive. And when there is an operating community, there should be an operating archive. Julie told me once when we talked about her research in Romania that an archive many times is actually part of the self-identity of a community. And you can see the difference between communities with or without an archive in terms of the strength of this self-identity. And finally, what do we plan to find there? Typically, materials from the immediate post-war period, 70s and 80s as well, but by far not all that. In many places, there are school records, organizational records, vital records that date back to the early 19th century. In certain cases, much further back. For example, in Italy, there are communities that the material of which is much older. A surprising amount of Holocaust-related documentation was and also will be found, I assume. In many places, the archival material is mixed up with printed books, mostly prayer books or other volumes of varying historical value. You also have to take this into consideration that you're not going to find a repository that holds only the material that you're after, namely the community records, but it will be mixed with a lot of printed books and published material as well. All in all, it's a great untapped historical source, and without a doubt, it's a very important part of European Jewish archival heritage. So just to recap quickly, and yes, we're within the time frame. We mapped 50 locations, but probably there is more. The situation of the collections vary in terms of community engagement. Some communities are very much engaged, some communities less so. In terms of storing conditions, in terms of accessibility, intellectual accessibility. So if you know what's in the material, there's a wide array of scenarios. The most important point, and the focus is that, I would like to emphasize that the focus is on supporting the communities to engage with this issue and help them find the best solution for their archives, and then help them to implement that solution. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And I want to go in terms of our time and the restraints, go on to our next speaker, Andreas Lehnardt. He is a professor of Jewish studies at the Johannes Gutenberg-University in Mainz. And I just want to point out that he is the head of a project on Hebrew binding fragments in Germany, and it is called Genizot Germania. And among the many publications he has done in this field, I just want to point out his seemingly latest one, which is the Genizot of the former synagogue at Freudenthal, which was published in 2020. And please, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you very much for having me at this very interesting conference. I just want to present a short overview about recent discoveries in Germany I'm involved in. And so in the past decades, several Genizot have been discovered in Germany, mostly in the southern part of Germany, but also now in the middle or center of Germany. So it's not only a phenomenon of southern German communities, but also in the other parts of Germany, there can be Genizot discovered in the future. It's obviously connected with the phenomenon that after the expulsion of Jews from larger cities in the 15th and 17th centuries until the beginning of the 20th centuries, many Jews in Germany lived in the rural countryside and founded there several smaller communities. Sometimes only a few families founded a new village community. And from this time on, we have synagogues with small attics and remnants of Genizot. Here you can see one of the attics I have researched, and sometimes it's really hard work and dusty work to rescue the materials from the roofs, and some books and documents are very much damaged, and sometimes you get the impression that the mice and the insects who live under these attics must have studied a lot of Yiddish and Hebrew books. And so today, of course, it's much easier than in decades before to identify these materials we found in synagogues like this Alsen's synagogue, which was built in the 18th century. Most of the material I researched is printed or written in the 18th or 19th century. So it's nothing to compare, of course, with the famous Cairo Genizot or other Genizot, maybe in other countries with older materials. But nevertheless, as Gábor has mentioned already, it's a very important archive, and even though it can be debated if a Genizot is really an archive or is a repository to decay and to left open things for self-destruction. So the discoveries made I researched were already made in the past decades, and sometimes I'm only the second or third researcher who is now cataloging the material. One of the most important discoveries I made is that usually these discoveries were made already in the 80s or 90s of the last decade, and since then nobody touched these materials or cataloged the materials. So my first aim was to make inventories and lists of material to make this available for further research. But in some cases, of course, we had also the opportunity to research again the attics. And here, for example, in Alsen's, we opened the roof again, and beneath the floor, we found additional materials, and we could research them again and catalog them again. Sometimes I'm informed only about material which has been found already years ago, but never researched thoroughly or cataloged. So here are the boxes and sometimes nylon baskets with materials from Genizot. And my first aim is then to identify the materials, the books, for example. If we have a first page of a book, it's easy to identify, a printing from Sulzbach, for example, or a 16th century Bible. But sometimes, of course, we have only very few pages, and then it's rather difficult to identify a book. Manuscripts are, of course, most important, and sometimes we have found also only pieces of manuscripts used in a secondary use as shoe inlets, like these ones here. Or we find also documents with real interesting stuff, like a manual of the Chevra Kadisha from a certain community in Mainz, my place of residence now. So. Of course, we find also many textiles, and tefillin are among the usual finds we discovered in the Genizot. And so we have not only archival material in the strict sense of the word, but also material remnants of the communities, which is also very important and interesting material, of course. And sometimes it's hard to document this material because you need to have specialists, especially when it comes to shoes. We have the exciting discovery in several Genizot here in Germany that we have a lot of children's shoes in among the findings. And so why shoes in a geniza is a real mystery to me. Maybe someone from the audience has an idea why shoes were put into a geniza. I still have not a real explanation, with the exception that also in Christian archives, sometimes child shoes were kept maybe as a sign or a protective sign, a kind of magic to keep the health of the child intact. But in Jewish sources, I have not found anything similar like this. And so please help me if you have an idea why we have a lot of shoes in our Genizot here. I'm excited also to learn about Genizot in other countries, of course, maybe in Romania, or we have the same, or in the Czech lands. So I'm not sure. It's really a mystery to me. Of course, we have also real documents, which are the most important stuff we have identified among the findings. Here we have a list with the proceedings of a kippe, of a prayer community, and they served also coffee and cake during their meetings. And so this is a very important document which opens the door to the vivid community in the 19th century, otherwise almost forgotten. And so these are the most exciting findings we can make among the documents in German Genizot. Of course, we have discovered hundreds and hundreds of prayer books and Bible editions. This is nothing unusual and most common among the other findings in other countries, I think, too. But of course, the sheer amount of books is sometimes really impressive, and to see also the developments in liturgy and the study of Bible with commentary, with translation or without translation. And so also this is a very interesting field of further interest into the material we have discovered. The first aim, of course, is to have an inventory and a statistic of all the findings. And so I opened several blogs in the internet. You can find them easily. And there you have photographs and preliminary descriptions of the material and an overview of all the material we have identified so far. Of course, sometimes only very brief identifications, and sometimes we can exactly give the date and the place of print. So, and we have then also made an inventory with the different kind of genre of literature, which is also sometimes very telling. For example, that the Talmud was not very much represented in the Genizot, and other works like Sefer Minhagim or compendia of Halacha were very much acknowledged and read, as I assume. And of course, there was in many smaller communities no real Beit Midrash or kind of study procedures. So the works containing Halacha L'Maaseh, the real instructions to do things, are much more represented among the findings in the Genizot I have researched so far. So you can have a look about the material on my websites, and we have also digitized everything we could and which seem to be worth digitizing. Of course, smaller pieces we haven't digitized, and sometimes we find also very small pieces and snippets of books that's not really worth to digitize them. But we keep, of course, everything, and everything is stored now in boxes. And so we go on from place to place and catalog the material in the surroundings of my place of stay in Mainz, so in the Rhineland and further on to southern Germany. And we discover a lot of unknown printings and rare printings, like this magic tablet with prayer for Lilith, and other rare printings here with a French translation, for example, maybe from Luneville in France. So we can identify also the ways of books and the ways of book selling. That's also maybe a future project to investigate the book selling ways. And of course, most important in our research are the textiles, and among them the wimpel or the mapot. Here a beautiful colored wimpel from the Mainz-Weisenau synagogue, which was partly burned because this synagogue was destroyed during the war. And since then the material was preserved, and we have here one wonderful inscription with the zodiac signs, Mazal Shor, and other signs of symbolism and telling about the rich culture of this small community in the vicinity of Mainz. And of course, we find also the usual stuff, I would say, you would expect in a Genizot like mezuzot and lulavim, small bands of to make the lulav, and iron or wooden boxes for the mezuzah. So I cannot count the number of items we already have included in our inventory, but it's roughly about 5,000 items until now, and we are continuing the work here in our region. Of course, there are other projects in Germany. I have to mention, of course, first of all, the Veitshöchheim Genizot, which is maybe the largest Genizot in Germany. It's close to Würzburg, and they have their own project now, and they are discovering also every month new material. But they haven't a public website until now, so it's not yet researchable. We started to collect the material and make it available through websites. So also the largest collection of my place here, it's the Niederzissen Synagogue, which was discovered only 2009. And it was a total surprise for the locals that there was such a hoard of manuscripts and materials. So I had the luck to be there when the last remnants of this Genizot were rescued from the attic, and it was absolutely exciting to discover these materials for the first time and to search through. And we found also very nice pieces of art, and these Torah binders are really exceptional. And there is a new catalog now also. We found this very beautiful letter of a Jewish soldier from the 19th century who writes to his parents at home, and he's in a tent camp in maybe Prussia then, and he writes back to his parents how cold the nights are and how he's longing for home. And so this is worth all the efforts I've done to have this document now among our findings. But also we have like this ketubah. It's a very interesting formula, Ashkenazic ketubah, with names known from other places and from the cemetery of Niederzissen. So this is also very interesting material for further genealogical research. So also the calendar material is very exciting and very important. We have calendars from Amsterdam, but also from Sulzbach and other places. These materials are also reflecting the reality of the community who is involved in selling cattle, mainly cattle, but also other goods from the rural sites. And so, well, the oldest calendar here is from 1785, but we have found also older calendars now, and so it's also a project within the project to research this calendric material, and of course there are specialists who are working on this already. So yeah, you see here another pile of boxes we have already seen. This is the pile from Niederzissen, I can tell you. This is not a secret anymore. We have done the research on these boxes. It's sometimes, I can tell you, it's hard work. It's really dusty and hard work to search and catalog these materials. There is a catalog on this. Anyone who's interested in this catalog, I can send you a copy. Just let me know. And yeah, as I said, the research is going on, and almost every month I'm now informed about new places, sometimes only very small synagogues, just refurbished or restored. And so among these findings, we have another collection of prayer literature, for example, sometimes with prayers from the 17th century onwards, very interesting rare printings, which are also interesting for bibliographical research. So I'm in contact, of course, with the National Library in Israel. And yeah, my recent project was on the Synagogue of Ediga, and I've just published also another book. So not only on Freudenthal, but also on Ediga. There is a small booklet now. And so this is another small synagogue in the Moselle Valley. And we researched this also. And yeah, we found a printing from the 17th century, which is one of the oldest printings we have ever identified. It's from Basel in the Switzerland. So also very interesting. And this material now is also available online. And yeah, everybody who's interested, I can send you also a copy of this new book, and it's available also as an ebook. So if you want to just have a look through, and there are beautiful pictures in it, and you can inform yourself about the outcome of our research. So thank you very much. I'm just short in time because I'm also involved in my faculty, and so during the semester I have no excuses, so I can't be at the final discussion, but I think Lenka may answer also for me, and yeah, I'm very grateful for the that I have the chance to present my project here, and yeah, thank you for having me. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very interesting talk, and we are going to our last speaker, who is Lenka Uličná, who is the curator of manuscripts and Genizot papers at the Jewish Museum in Prague. She's also a teacher of Hebrew and literature and material culture. That is one of her specialties, material culture and Jewish languages. And she actually recently published a number of articles on Bohemian and Moravian Genizot. And so she will talk to us about the attics of Bohemia and Moravian synagogues. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. I'm really so grateful for this panel, because usually the topic of so-called modern Genizot does not really fit well any conference panel, and is usually very marginal. But here, being marginal is the kind of point. So I'm really happy to be here, and I very much like the previous presentations. The Jewish Museum in Prague has been researching Genizot in Bohemia and Moravia since 1996. This research was initiated by the Federation of Jewish Communities in the Czech Republic, which is the owner of most of the synagogues in the Czech Republic, and therefore also the owner of the Genizot finds. Federation of Jewish Communities is also one of the founders of the Jewish Museum in Prague. And this is why the Jewish Museum in Prague has been authorized to conduct the research in Genizot. The research was initiated because the Genizot finds were in acute danger, as many of the synagogue buildings, particularly in Moravia, were literally plundered by individuals in the 1990s, as a result of which the objects in Genizot were either damaged or wrongfully and improperly exploited, and hence devalued. We never considered Genizot to be a clear archive. It is really an in-between institution, somewhere between a creepy library, messy archive, and collection of damaged Judaica. The aim was to keep always Genizot together. So the Jewish Museum in Prague in the 1990s decided to make it part of the museum collection and not the library and not the archives. Since the 1990s, the museum staff has been rescuing and preserving Genizot finds by carefully removing all the valuable objects and taking them to the Jewish Museum in Prague for safekeeping and further research. Here, I would like to stress the relativity of the word valuable. Sometimes a person appears in the museum with a plastic bag full of fragments of prayer books, which are common 19th century prints, and says, I'm an owner of a building that used to be a synagogue, and recently we have the roof repaired, and look what we have found in the attic. Do you want to keep it? And well, actually, we always do, but we would have been much more interested in. Sorry, why the presentation doesn't? What should I do to move my presentation? Can somebody help me? Here, okay. Okay, so we would much more be interested in pieces of textiles that might look like rags, or pieces of metal that used to be part of candlesticks, or just fragments of German letters or notes that most probably ended up in the dump because they have not been recognized to be valuable. This is a simple certificate of circumcision for Wilhelm Polacek, and these are items that usually get lost because nobody recognizes them as important. Up to now, the Jewish Museum in Prague has gathered finds from, sorry, I was too quick, gathered finds from some 15 Genizot in Bohemia and Moravia, comprising about 4,000 to 5,000 items, textiles, paper, and parchment. At the beginning of November 2021, our museum has started a new project called Secrets in the Attic, supported by the EEA and Norway grants. There will be 2 exhibitions directly in the regions where the findings come from, and a special website, genizot.cz, and we'll also use social networks like Facebook and HistoryPin. We plan to document the process of making a Genizot part of a museum collection, to document how museum staff picks up, restores approximately 1,800 objects, processes and catalogs these materials that document in a special way the daily life of defunct Czech and Moravian Jewish communities. This is a very exciting work. However, I still feel we do not know enough about the very concept of Genizot. Let me explain what I mean. The definition of Genizot by Solomon Schechter and Elkan Adler from the Jewish Encyclopedia states that Genizot is, I quote, the storeroom or depository in a synagogue, a cemetery in which worn-out and heretical or disgraced Hebrew books or papers are placed. A Genizot serves, therefore, the twofold purpose of preserving good things from harm and bad things from harming, end of quote. So there are 2 ways of protection here. First, the Genizot is to protect, let's say, mezuzah scroll from people who might carve out the God's name and make an amulet out of it, which, if I'm not mistaken, is halachically not okay. This is what might have happened here on this mezuzah scroll. And second, the Genizot is to protect people from bad books, dangerous texts, like this Yiddish missionary handbook, which is written in very, very nice Yiddish, actually. Of course, sometimes Genizot simply protects people from reading from a kosher text that is so worn out that it became illegible and therefore could be misleading. But there is more to the concept of protection of these archives. This is a topic I would like to come back to in the second part of my presentation. Let me start with a question that might bother you too. Genizot is an institution that helps objects to decay. So how can it be considered an archive? In Alsace, there was a great exhibition on local Genizot a couple of years ago. And the most fascinating thing for me there was a proof that a Genizot from an attic of an older synagogue was moved to an attic of a newly built synagogue. They did not bury it, which would be very legitimate to expect, but rather preserve it in a weird way. We usually speak about temporary and permanent geniza, the permanent being the one in cemetery where the objects are buried. A temporary geniza would be the closed space attached to synagogue, either a special room or an attic. However, already the research in the Cairo geniza showed that a geniza attached to a synagogue does not have to be just temporary. It does not work like once in a while somebody takes the papers out and buries them. The same is the case of at least some Czech Genizot. I searched our archives to find some mention about a geniza and was not successful. There is no explicit mention of a geniza, even in documents that mention repairing of roofs. But actually, the very fact that somebody repairs a roof and leaves there the geniza maybe proves the permanent or semi-permanent character of the geniza. It looks like it was considered an important part of the synagogue. If it was meant to be preserved, there is probably a reason for this. First, I was thinking about economic reasons because burial cost money, but that cannot be the main cause. The side effect of my small research in the archives is that it helped me understand one aspect of geniza, which I call shredding. Actually, I'm not an archivist and not even a historian, so the research in the archives really helped me understand what we found in our Genizot. The findings in the Genizot reflect on the inner life of the Kilot, like this Psak Din, decision of Beit Din regarding a settlement of a dispute, possibly defamation between Reb Isaac and Reb Jacob, the second one who has to apologize to the first and his wife, and none of them is entitled to appeal under penalty of 12 Hollander. But the document was not signed by the parties, just by Meir ben Gershon, so it was probably just to keep the record, which was later discarded in the Geniza. Other objects that we can find both in the archives and in the Genizot are printed and handwritten orders or lists of prayers for high holiday services. There is a whole set of these lists from 1860s to 1880s. These small ephemeral items were sometimes sent to the members of the Kehillah together with an invitation to come to worship. These texts say a lot not only about the coexistent culture of prints and manuscript, but also about numbers of people actually attending synagogues. Sometimes the objects from Genizot can be combined. Paper dolls with dresses were found in a siddur with ownership note and the name of Israel Goldschmidt. On the left, there is a Shtar Tnaim, the pre-wedding contract of this Israel Goldschmidt and Rebecca Muneles from 30th of July 1827. And these were possibly the parents of the kids playing with the dolls. Beside all the prayer books, scrolls, Bibles, etc., we find all types of documents in the Geniza that can also be found in the archives and which quite often do not, halakhically, require a Geniza and sometimes even do not have much to do with Judaism. This fragment of a military accounting book comes probably from the War of the Bavarian Succession. You can probably read Colorado Infantry Rechnungsbuch, Grenadier Hauptmann, and the date. We find a lot of materials connected to schools and teaching in Genizot, like alphabets and different kinds of textbooks. And sometimes they can be really revealing, like these inconspicuous handwritten notes of Samuel Löw entitled Bnei Zion, with a note in Holeshau 1847. Their analysis helps us to understand the real form of the compulsory examination of Jewish ethics, which Jewish couples had to pass before marriage, according to the imperial decree of 1810. The decree of the Court Study Commission of 14 December 1810 requested, I quote, that Jewish brides and grooms pass with success an exam given by the provincial district authority, Kreisamt, on the content of the book, Herz Homberg Nezion, in order to receive the official permission for marriage, end of quote. Nezion is a really difficult German text in a difficult script. You might get an idea from the small passage from the second section, what we can learn about God from created things. On the other hand, the Nezion manuscript from the Genizot, which is a fragment, is quite easy text in Judeo-German, not in Yiddish, but really German in Hebrew script, and very much resembles another book by Homberg, Ben Yakir, which also takes the form of a teacher-student conversation and is written in German. And it raises a fundamental question. What was the actual text from which Jewish couples were preparing for exams in Jewish ethics? I assume that the finding from the Moravian Genizot testifies that rather than the hard-to-read German Hertholberg textbook, some standardized extracts served as study material, which could be made for the couple by a local rabbi, teacher, or scribe, or perhaps by the groom-to-be himself. This assumption is supported by the testimony of Dr. Heinrich Flesch, a rabbi of the Moravian Jewish community in Dolní Kanitz, who mentions that he possesses similar text containing extracts from the textbook in the form of questions and answers. I chose a couple of items that might be interesting for archival research, but you will not find them in the archives of Jewish Museum, but rather directly in the museum catalog as collection items, which might be a bit confusing. Why is it so? Why did the Genizot become part of the collection and not the archives? The reason is that there are other functions of Genizot that we still understand very little, like why beside the Torah scrolls and prayer books that require Genizot because of the holy names they contain, there are also items like pieces of clothes, and I'm not speaking about talitot, and shoes we've already seen before and will see more of them in a minute. Again, I'm not talking about chalitza shoes because these are not chalitza shoes. These are very ordinary shoes, both pairs and single shoes worn by men, women, and children, everything. Again, more shoes, or candlesticks, candle snuffers, and nails. These finds cannot be considered accidental because there are simply too many of them, and there are similar finds in different Genizot all over the Central Europe. As already said, the function of Genizot is protection, but what if the protection is more complicated? What if there are other protective functions of Genizot, apotropaic, not official, secondary, perhaps secret? We are talking about rural areas. None of the, for example, Prague, Genizot, or some other big city, none of these Genizot has been preserved. So in this rural Genizot, the impact of local folk practices can be expected. There is a very interesting project called Deliberately Concealed Garments that deals with items of clothing that have been deliberately hidden or buried within the structure of a building. I quote from this website, the evidence for this practice dates back to the Middle Ages. Builders, owners, or residents appear to have hidden clothing and other objects in the fabric of buildings, end of quote. The project tries to make people aware of this folk practice and make them report and document these items on the website. Deliberately concealed garments have been found all over the world, in the UK, mainland Europe, Australia, and North America. Dinah Eastop, an internationally renowned textile conservator from the University of Southampton, set up the project in 1998 and, if I'm not mistaken, continues to lead it. She states that, I quote, "The practice of concealment seems to have been widespread in terms of both geography and time, but the reasons for concealment are likely to be culturally diverse," end of quote. What we found in Genizot, except for the exclusively Jewish items like the scrolls and prayer books, is strikingly similar to what was found in rural houses in the UK and elsewhere, like the women's clothes. On the left, you see something from the UK. On the right, you see what we found in Genizot in Zalužan. Or metal objects. Here are the candlesticks, again, very similar, found from the UK, from some rural buildings, and what we found again in Genizot in Rychnov nad Kněžnou, Reichenau. And of course, the shoes. There are like hundreds of shoes. These are from Australia, and these are our shoes. Dinah Eastop cautiously states that, I quote, "The concealment are believed to serve a protective function against incoming malevolent forces," end of quote. The truth is that we will probably never be sure about the function of the hidden garments and of the garments and shoes in Genizot, because, I quote again, "the very lack of documentation is a feature of this practice," end of quote. Some say that caches have been linked to Freemasonry or simply folk magic, but there are simply no written sources. It might be disappointing, but it's not surprising that I have not found anything about this apotropaic function of Genizot in rabbinic sources. All we can do is stick to the materiality. The shoes and the clothes are there in the Genizot, because probably anything that is not forbidden is allowed. Especially the shoes really are very, very numerous in the finds, and I really believe they are there on purpose. June Swan, who was the first in the 1950s to notice habit of concealing shoes in buildings, also asked why shoes, and her answer was that it is, I quote, "the only garment we wear which retains the shape, the personality, the essence of the wearer," end of quote. The Jewish context of shoes in Genizot still has to be researched and described, but across cultures, the purpose of ritual use of shoes seems to be protection. So we can assume that if the purpose of shoes and other garments in the Genizot was protective, the items might have protected the synagogue, the community, or the objects that deserve protection according to the requirement of Genizot. The Torah scrolls and other texts are written in Hebrew script. Nowadays, the possible other function of Genizot faded. Today, the concept of Genizot is rather minimalistic and cleaned of all possible folk magic practices. The nowadays burial societies only fear the treasure hunters that would come and dig in the Genizot, and that is the main reason why even the modern Genizot is still a bad secret institution. I will finish my speech with pointing out the liminal character of these very special archives. This is a picture from field research in the Genizot in Zalužany. Majority of the Genizot finds here were piled nearby the entrance of the attic, at the threshold, and around the window, and some other items were placed along the attic in the very liminal spaces. If we take the actual space into account, it really looks like the Genizot is possibly protecting the synagogue from some malevolent powers coming in. And the last picture is a very new acquisition. Just a month ago, we found, beside other things, a pile of hundreds of old nails in the Genizot of the synagogue in Rychnov, Reichenau, and I claim that even these highly metal objects should be considered part of Genizot archives too. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, all four speakers. And I think that this is a very inspiring panel. And I would suggest a few things here. First of all, when we talk about endangered archives, I think the endangered archives point us to endangered history, because what everybody has been pointing out is there are many, many questions. The more we dig, the more questions we have, and we are looking for answers, and this is a process, and it is far from finished, and that also the periphery as the shifts in paradigms take place, the shift from the central issues to the margins and the miscellaneous has led to putting the marginal items and miscellaneous items into the center of questions, because here is where we are pointed to the daily lives of people. And I just want to quickly go through the papers, and Julie's paper about the tragedy of that is conveyed by looking at all these sort of disappeared communities and their fragments. This is a very dense area, and it also points to, for instance, the dense area of Germany, a relatively small territory, which at some point had, I think, more than 3,500 Jewish communities. These are astonishing numbers, and it also points to the fact that Jewish history of the small communities, that is sort of the dominant, actually, story that goes through all of Europe. And in this case, this is only shedding light on the German-speaking communities. And to what Gábor was saying, the confusion today, what do we mean by archives? The word archives, not even the concept, has become very fashionable. Every academic likes to talk about archives, and it is sort of become very sort of spread out and less defined. And from the position of historians and archivists, there is a lot of, abuse of the word archives. And it probably started, with these French questions about what are the archives, and then come all these sort of, and we need to reconsider what is archives and what have they to do with history. And it is really the endangered history, and also what Gábor was saying about the fragmentary character. History and the study of history is always fragmentary. There is no such thing as the totality. And in that sense, this panel points us to the fact that this is the groundwork here, and that leads maybe to higher levels. But again, I mean, the prominent and luminaries, they tell us something about themselves, but not really about the communities. The history of the communities lies in these things that we have just been talking about. And that also goes for Andreas's paper about the richness of the landscape, and that in these Genizot, that is where the history is buried. And it is the material culture that tells us so many things for which we don't have the answers. But that is something that also future generations might have better answers, as we are now also going into sort of microhistory, microarchaeology, sort of DNA research. And in those shoes, there may be hidden answers that need to be going through the chemistry archives and laboratories of other departments. And yes, and Lenka's paper really sort of, in a way, sort of sums it all up. And this is something that really is very central, actually, to our whole quest. And the opening of Eastern Europe is, in a way, has opened our eyes probably more than ever before to something that is out there and is actually hidden and is endangered. But on the other hand, history has always been endangered. The Jewish community has always been endangered. And this is our job to work on this. And so Yes, questions. I don't know how this is exactly handled with questions. And thank you. Thank you so much. This is very, very important.
So maybe if we switch around, and are there questions? I see there are questions online, and we start with the online questions. Should we do that? And then take the questions of the audience? I hope I can. Is Sandro here?
Maybe Frank could read the online questions.
Frank, you see the...
I can read the question.
Okay, thank you. Yes.
So
Thank you. Thank you.
From your papa or a fellow 2 years ago or 3 years ago. Thank you very much for a great session. A question for Julie Dawson. The archival survey website looks fantastic. I clicked on Cluj and I noticed that, for example, the Cluj, Hungarian Kolozsvár Israelites, that's 1886, 1949 Neolog, is located at the Romanian National Archives, Cluj. Is there a typology of which documents are in such centralized regional state archives and which documents are in local synagogues or smaller locations building? So that was the question of Jon.
Okay, so I'll answer now, and I have to say, without seeing in front of me, there's maybe 1,000 different catalog entries, or more than that, actually, from this project. So, but if the repository says it's the National Archives, then that is not the collection that's at the Jewish community. It's some kind of material that's held by the National Archives branch of Cluj. So the National Archives branch, there's a county branch in every county in Romania, and depending on the place, they collected or seized or material found its way there at some point in time, generally in the post-war period. Sometimes they have large collections. I'm trying to think of one. I think Lugos has an interesting, I think in Timișoara there's an interesting community collection from Lugos, which, for example, the Lugos community I don't think even knew about, with some very old documents. But this is totally dependent from place to place. It's completely unpredictable. The documents that are at the communities, the easiest way to find that on the website is to choose the repository and then choose Cluj Jewish Community Archives or something like that. I can't quite remember how it's called. And then you have to go the search function. You have to click a certain button and then it'll pop up. But it'll tell you what to do. Yeah, I hope that answered the question, Ava. But basically, there are community archives both at the National Archives as well as these collections which were created by this project that are at the communities themselves. Natalia? Oh yeah, there's a...
Should we move to the live questions? Yes.
I'm just so eager because this is such a fantastic session. So I wanted maybe for everybody such richness of material. If you could comment on local interactions, if you could talk a little bit more about how your work plays out in those villages, in those towns, with people living around those Genizot. For Andreas, this is terribly presumptuous, and I apologize, but why are these synagogues standing? Meaning, why weren't they burned or destroyed? You showed some pictures with buildings nicely renovated and now discovered to be former synagogues. For Julie, I would love to hear more about the guy at the center of your project. Did you trace him as his life story a little bit more? And I also kept on thinking about Hili Gvalsman's work on cemeteries and synagogues in Poland, and I wonder how many interesting parallels there could be or differences. And for Gábor, and I think it's also a general comment connected to what was said. I keep on thinking that that the story has a prehistory that is post-World War I discussion, when there are communities and synagogues and people, and the communities discuss that kind of rescue of communal records and prayer books, and wooden synagogues are burning in East Central Europe. So it's, again, I keep on thinking, how are these discussions in any way relevant or informative for what is being done today? But thank you very much.
So should we take all questions, right? And then you want to react? Are there more live questions?
Well, if there are no other questions, then I think also the panelists should, if they have comments on each other,
sure,
maybe to give a chance to say something. And I see that Andreas is still there, so maybe that to give him priority if he is still able to speak.
Is Andreas there? I don't see him.
I don't see him either.
Okay.
So
Actually, should I just go first? Yeah. And since Andreas isn't there, I'm not the expert that he is, but I to your question about how those synagogues survive, I've read a little bit about that, and it's often because those communities had disappeared by the time the war started. And that happened in a few other places. It's also happened in Transylvania. The synagogues in general survived there. They didn't have Kristallnacht and other things. But I was very confused trying to find the shul in this one town. This was years ago, way before this project. And because I knew that there had been one there. And nobody, normally, in interactions with locals, normally you can go to a town and you can just ask someone on the street, where's the Jewish church, is just the way that they would call it. And they'll know something. They'll tell you, well, it's over there, now it's a factory, or now it's a this or that, but somebody generally knows something, or you can find somebody that knows. And in this town, which was not that small, they were just like, you don't mean the Jewish church, what you're trying to say is the German church, or like, because Transylvania had all the 5 different recognized religions or something. So, and I was so confused, and then I finally found out many years later, actually, because I found a zincograph of that synagogue, that it had been torn down already in the 20s or 30s because the community had gotten so small and essentially moved to the next largest town. So that's I think also an interesting part of Jewish scholarship that's often not talked about or sort of forgotten, that a lot of this, in the 30s, the 20s and 30s, things were already changing in drastic ways. So for me, interactions with locals, so I've been working in Romania and in Transylvania since 2007 with Jewish heritage, and so I have a sort of a very a lot of experience working with the locals and talking to them about these things. And there's every single kind of story, from like the awful to the positive. As far as working with the archives, like working with the Jewish communities, as I mentioned, and they're generally very supportive. I cut this out of my talk because it was already too long, but the presidents, the younger ones often kind of know there's something there, but they just don't quite know what to do with it. And generally everybody thinks it's not valuable, especially the post-war thing. This also didn't get into my talk, but if they have material, they think that it's only going to be interesting to historians if it's from the war, or maybe before war. I mean, the fact that this post-war period is really fascinating for me, and for many other historians, is just totally, like, why? It's often what they say. This is starting to change. The older presidents, And when I say older, so I sort of mean like post fall of the Iron Curtain. So the older ones that had been presidents or somebody even before that, they often know there's material and they're sometimes more guarded. You have to, there's a few communities that I did not gain access to because the presidents were very like, well, I don't want to get into any sorts of gender dynamics, but it wasn't always easy, I'll just say that. And yeah. So, and I also didn't talk about this in the presentation. I mean, for me, what this particular collection begs is some sort of like artistic intervention, like a digital humanities thing, as the group talked about yesterday. That would be amazing, but it would require it requires a lot of logistics, people with a really set of skills that's very difficult to find there. But going into these places, I can guarantee you, in these villages, generally, people don't know anymore, I mean, in general, about all these shuls that were there. But in every village, there certainly are a few people that would know and be able to talk to you about it. And perhaps the material that was sold, as the project yesterday talked about how the material from the shul and Gross Inzesdorf had been used for other buildings, and they even knew where those windows were. There are things like that that could probably be found out. That would be fascinating, but it's like that's like a whole giant project, and it would require Romanian partnerships. And this also goes to then Andrei Partos. I would love to find out more about him. I looked a little bit, just like couldn't find anything. I assume he has a file at the CNSAS, which is the Securitate, the Secret Police Archive. So I'm an accredited researcher there. So maybe next time I go there, I'll request it. I believe my theory about him is that he obviously he was a survivor in some way. My theory is that he wasn't deported, but that he was part of he was conscripted into the forced labor, as the way that many men from that area survived was because they were conscripted before the deportations. So he would fall into that age bracket. I also didn't talk about this in a few files. There's like interactions that he has with Holocaust survivors, and they're also very emotional, which to me says something. And I would love to know more. And I'm right now debating, like when I finish my current project, do I try to do something with this, or do I do something with material I found from the 18th century about a Jewish girl kidnapped by a Catholic priest in Cluj, and then whisked away to a monastery, and then married off to a Hungarian aristocrat. So that's also a very fascinating story, and I don't know which one to choose from, so we'll see.
Okay.
Yeah, I talk too much.
Thank you. I think Eva has a question, or she wants to read a question.
But maybe also the question to interactions with the other locals. I think that was addressed to everybody, no?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so I'll just briefly answer. When we take out the finds from the Genizot that are in possession of the Federation, there is usually a great cooperation with the locals because they know they just can't take care of the objects themselves, and they are very much interested in short-term exhibition, and this is exactly what we plan to do in the next years, like making an exhibitions of the items that we found in Western Bohemia, Eastern Bohemia, really in villages. We do not plan to make an exhibition on the local Genizot in Prague because it really doesn't make much sense. And we really go into the regions and cooperate with the people. Sometimes the synagogues are owned by people who bought the synagogue and just live there and make it a normal house. And in these cases, they are usually happy to get rid of the objects because it's kind of weird thing to have Jewish items in the attic, and they are very happy to get rid of it. Sometimes if there are people who are more ambitious and want to make a local memorial monument or something, they just keep the items, and we try to help them understand what they have. So I think the cooperation here works pretty well. Just one mention on the why the synagogues survived here in the Czech Republic. In many cases, the synagogues were bought by the Hussites church and they were turned into churches. That's how they survived. Or exactly what Julie said, there were no communities even before the World War, so the buildings stayed as they were and were used, for example, like storage rooms for chemicals, textiles, and things like this. And this is actually very, very good because in this case, nobody renovated them, nobody moved, nobody did anything in the roof. So this is why we also have quite a lot of items from the attics. Thank you.
I would like to just quickly respond to the question if the histories of the archives are relevant, if the discussions after World War I are relevant. They definitely are, from our point of view. Anyone who has seen community archives will attest to that. That it's true that sometimes you just don't understand how things ended up there. Sometimes it's very puzzling. There are items, by items I mean documents, that just don't fit the whole picture. You don't understand what's the story behind it. Understanding the various discussions about what to do with archives and so on, what you just mentioned, obviously will help us dissect the history of the given repository, and that's very important. So the history of the archival history in itself holds definitely significance and relevance. As far as talking to the locals, obviously our situation is a little bit different than that of Lenka and Andreas, in that it's closer to what Julie described, that we have to talk to the communities, not necessarily the local non-Jewish population. And in this, we use kind of a humble approach, so to say. I know my way around in certain parts of the world and definitely don't in other parts. This is probably true for everyone working in this project. So we're trying to find the local experts who can put us in touch with the local communities, who can create spaces where we can have the conversation, who are intimately familiar with the local history, languages, the whole scenery. So our first job, one of our first jobs, is to create these connections or remobilize these connections, because obviously the foundation is quite well connected in this world. So just to remobilize these connections for that very purpose, what I just described.
So can I continue with the question of Alexandra Sabo and my question? Alexandra asked you all whether, and all regions, is there online crowdsourcing included? So, for example, what if some boxes or parts of collections ended up by individuals and not in a community institution? And my question goes to the same direction. So I would like to ask you all, actually, about the first question is rather an institutional question, whether we could understand this type of sources as collections which we can also use for our Holocaust studies projects, and if the answer is yes, how? I just want to mention that this giant Horizon 2020 project, ERI, maybe would give some possibilities to link the Jeruzsa and other initiatives, the Genizot, etc. So there are many possibilities to link these data or metadata of the collections to the universe of the Holocaust research. And my second question is a methodological one, and I really liked the comment of Frank and you, Gábor. How can we understand these collections? Are they just collections of an institution, the Jewish community, or rather a kind of ego documents or collective ego collections, because they are the ego documents of a Jewish community, which were produced in a collective way, and I think it's an important methodological question how we can deal with this type of historical sources, and I think this is a bit the same as Alexandra is thinking about these collections. Can we touch upon these collections as a heritage of a lost community, or just very rationally understanding as an institution? So I prefer the first one. So we have to do something with this definition, how we can work with these collections to keep their integrity. So I don't know the answer, but I just wanted to ask you, what do you think about it? So thank you very much.
Well, community documents in private hands, that's a very touchy issue. You might have seen in the past few months that there were community documentation in the Judaica market appearing, and there have been a lot of controversy around it. And it's a very complex question. It has political, historical, legal, ethical ramifications. The National Library of Israel, with other organizations, the foundation included, is working on a kind of a guidance or a general platform that is intended for heritage institutions, individuals, and funding bodies to deal with this issue. So community documents in private hands, what to do with it, when we have that kind of guidance, I'm happy to answer that question on my end. But Sandra, if I understand you correctly, you also were referring to maybe collecting from individuals community documents. That's if that's what your question refers to. This is not the scope, at least of my project. I mean, we are trying to locate these endangered Jewish archives, and as I talked about it extensively, trying to find the best way to help the owners. In this part of the project, or in this phase, we're not really focusing on individuals. Of course, if something appears, such as the cases that I mentioned, then we'll react.
Actually, if I may just comment on what Gábor was just saying, I mean, Leo Baeck Institute Archives is actually a good example in this, because the archive is organized by donors, by individuals and families. And one of the characteristics, and that actually goes to the question, what happens after World War I, is that the sort of dissolution of small communities, individuals were the ones who were preserving by not knowing otherwise, other things that would have otherwise gotten lost when the synagogue no longer had a minyan, and when things were getting lost. And then the same goes, of course, after 1933, when people understand that if they are not going to collect and preserve the community files, the Nazis will destroy them. And that is just one paradigm, which is probably true. I mean, it's certainly true for Eastern Europe after World War II, but probably before also. And, in this world of ignorance, I mean, we have these sort of alerted individuals who do the work. I mean, this, I think, points all to this question: how much are living human beings as eyewitnesses and sort of as people with secondary memory, valuable resources and sources for historians and writing history. I mean, I point to Marianne Hirsch, her work, and that is sort of one of the seminal works in this field. And actually, I'm surprised that the name hasn't fallen in our panel, maybe in the other ones.
Just regarding the collections in private hands, actually, I wanted to suggest maybe Livia Odoshi says something about that at the roundtable, because the Erie project that she's working on, I believe, speaks specifically to that. So maybe that's interesting for Alexandra. And just a short anecdote on that, at one of the communities where I was, it came to light that there was documents missing because the local historian of the community had sort of taken a whole lot of boxes home, because so they weren't the documents weren't entirely unknown. Certain people knew about them, and this made the processing process quite difficult, because so essentially he had chosen what he found to be the most interesting. So the documents had been groomed in some way, but then also were missing. In the end, we were able to get those documents back, and we ended up making a whole separate series, essentially, of the things that he had selected. So this kind of thing happens. I haven't found it otherwise. If there's not a Jewish community, with my experience, if there's not a Jewish community, then there's rarely somebody in the city that's collecting like that. Just quickly to Eva about collections being institutional or ego documents, I would also, I speak only from my experience, but there's a few occasions where there's a really wide array of items, objects, documents from a community, and then it's very much, I would say, like ego documents of this community. And the specific example would be Mediash in southern Transylvania, where it was as if first of all, there weren't deportations there, but everybody immigrated in the 50s and 60s, and I think it felt really like in the 80s somebody just locked the door and left the shul. And so that's where we found sort of similar to Genizot in the women's balcony, not really in the attic, just the women's balcony. And everything possible was there: community archives, personal items, textiles, hand-stitched, the curtains for the Aron Kodesh, everything. And that was fascinating. And then this is absolutely like a record of this community's life, really from when it was founded by Bohemian, German-speaking Jews in the mid-19th century, relatively late. Other Jews were there earlier. Until the immigration of the last members. So, but then other occasions, there's just a few things. And in that case, it's some kind of ego document of the community, but there's not so much that can be gathered from that, my experience.
Okay, so thank you. If there aren't any further questions, we would close this panel and are running late for a round table discussion, but there is a break of 10 minutes, I'd say, for coffee. Thank you. Thank you all for being with us.